A question can change everything. And in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, we find the most important question there is. It's a question that Jesus asked his disciple Peter. It's the question Jesus is asking you today. It's a question that Jesus asks each and every one of us every day of our lives. And the way we answer this question as an individual has the power to shape everything about our lives, and how we answer this question as a community will shape our lives together. This all-important question is found in Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 29. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" From today through Easter Sunday morning, we are going to explore the Gospel of Mark together in an effort to help us as a community and you as an individual answer this question for yourself. I believe your answer to "Who do you say that I am?" is the most consequential answer any of us will ever give. It's a question that we all have to answer for ourselves. Now, to help you answer this question for yourself, we've developed a reading plan that will guide you through the Gospel of Mark for yourself over the coming weeks. The plan is 5 short readings, Monday through Friday, and then every Sunday, the time that we spend together will be based on one of the readings that we read that week. There's also a daily devotional to accompany the readings that'll help point out key themes and ideas from the readings each day. You can download a copy of the reading plan and sign up for the daily devotionals by going to the church website, broadmoormethodist.org, or by texting the word MARK to the number you see on the screen. Now, this morning what I want to do is to help give you a brief overview of the Gospel of Mark by answering some basic questions about Mark, like who wrote it, when was it written, how was it structured, and as well as pointing out a few things to be looking for as you read it for yourself. So who was Mark? Now, the truth is we don't know for certain. What we do know is that from the very early tradition is that Mark was a companion of Peter and that he wrote down what he learned about Jesus from the apostle. An early leader in the church named Eusebius of Caesarea wrote what is considered to be the very first church history. And in that history book, he recounts an even earlier tradition that says this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things done or said by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. From the middle of the 2nd century, the tradition is held that the Gospel of Mark was written by a friend and companion of the disciple Peter, and that he wrote his gospel based on what he learned about Jesus from Peter. And it's widely agreed by scholars and pastors and teachers that even though Mark is found second in order in the New Testament, remember there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that Mark was actually the first gospel written. And there are many places where scholars believe that Matthew and Luke quite likely had a copy of Mark with them when they were writing their own versions of the Jesus story. It's most likely that The Gospel of Mark was written sometime in the mid to late 60s AD, possibly into the late 70s AD, so around 30 to 40 years after Jesus' ministry. And one of the things that you'll notice about the Gospel of Mark is that it is action-packed. It's the shortest of the Gospels, and all throughout the book, Jesus and his disciples are always on the move. As you're reading, one of the things you'll notice is that over and over again, something happens immediately. For example, just in chapter 1, Mark uses the words we translate immediately 11 times. Mark 1:10, Jesus is baptized, and immediately, as he's coming up out of the water, the heavens are torn apart. And the Spirit, in verse 12, the Spirit immediately drives Jesus out into the wilderness. In verse 18, Jesus calls Peter and Andrew to follow him, and immediately they leave their nets and follow Jesus. And then in the next verse, he sees James and John and immediately calls them. Over and over again, as you read, you will notice that things happen immediately. Action moves very fast, at least in the first 8 chapters of Mark. And then in the second half of the book, it slows down. The first half of Mark is all about helping us discover who Jesus is. The second half of the gospel, chapters 9 through 16, is all about helping us to discover why Jesus died. The cross begins to loom very large in the second half of the gospel. It's the second half of the gospel that Mark invites us to wrestle with the questions of why Jesus had to die. Now, there are 2 important questions that you need to keep in mind as you read through the Gospel of Mark. Every story, every miracle, every encounter is designed to help you answer for yourself, who is Jesus? And then, how will I respond to him? Every day as you read, I hope that you will ask yourself, what does this passage teach me about who Jesus is? And then ask yourself, if this is who Jesus is, then how will I respond? Ultimately, every story, every miracle, every parable, every healing in Mark is intended to help you answer for yourself the question Jesus asked in Mark chapter 8. Who do you say that I am? Now, Mark gives us his answer to this question in the very first verse of the gospel. Look at Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So let's ask our 2 questions of this one verse. Who is Jesus? Mark makes 2 claims about Jesus in this one verse. First, he claims that Jesus is the Christ. Now, Christ is not Jesus' last name, and he doesn't have a middle initial H. Christ is a title. It's a title that has profound biblical meaning. It means anointed one. In Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament, the word for anointed, the anointed one is Messiah. The anointed one is the person that God has chosen for a special purpose. For example, in the book of Exodus, God appoints Aaron to be a priest for the people, and God directs Moses to anoint Aaron with oil and consecrate him for the divine work God wanted Aaron the priest to do. And in the book of 1 Samuel, God has the prophet Samuel find David and anoint him with oil, consecrating him for the divine work that God wanted David to do as king. Now, Aaron and David, along with everyone else that God called and anointed to serve in roles as priests or kings, were flawed and fallen human beings. But in the books of the prophets, we discover that God had promised to one day, when the time was right, that God would act in a new way and send his own Son to be both priest and king, not just for the people of Israel, but for all the people of the world, for you and for me. In the very first verse of his gospel, Mark is telling us that for him, Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise. Jesus is God's Son, the one God has anointed to rescue, redeem, save, and heal and set free God's beloved creation. So if this is who Jesus is, how do we respond? Ultimately, what God desires is that we surrender ourselves to Jesus and allow His Spirit to shape our lives so that our lives are Jesus-shaped. The word the church uses for this process of our lives being shaped so that they look more and more like Jesus is discipleship. And ultimately, Mark's gospel is a gospel calling us to transformational discipleship. Now, I believe living as a disciple of Jesus is the very best way there is to live. It's not always easy, and I won't pretend to always get it right. But one of the reasons I love the Gospel of Mark is that in this gospel, we meet the person that I personally identify with out of everyone in the whole Bible. You can find him in Mark chapter 9. It's the story of a father who has a son who is sick. A son that he's done everything he can to try to help. And nothing has worked. When he hears about Jesus and the miracles that Jesus is doing, he brings his son to Jesus' disciples and implores them to heal him, but they are unable to do so. Finally, when Jesus shows up, the father begs him, please, if you are able, please have pity on us and help us. And Jesus responds, if you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes. And immediately, there's that word again, immediately, the father of the child cried out, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. I tell you, that's my favorite verse in the Bible. It's my favorite verse in the whole Bible because it is the statement that is most true for me. I believe living as a disciple of Jesus is the very best way there is to live. I believe living as a disciple of Jesus is the way that leads to a life of hope and joy and love and peace that we all want for ourselves and for our families. I believe it. And at times, I need help with my unbelief. What I've discovered, especially as I turn to the Gospel of Mark, is that in those moments of my own doubt and despair and unbelief, I can turn to the Jesus that we meet in the Gospel of Mark and find what I need to transform my doubt into trust, my despair into hope, and my unbelief into belief. I know who Jesus is for me. Who is he for you? How will you answer his question? Who do you say that I am?